The best way to memorize new vocabulary is not to memorize new vocabulary. Confused? Let me explain. A lot of people like to try and memorize new vocabulary. They may have a list of 20 or 30 words that they want to learn each day. They may have a big list of vocabulary on a spreadsheet that they will now try to remember every day. Some people like to use flashcards, where on one side of the flashcard you have the new word, and then on the other side you have the translation into your own language, or maybe a picture of something, and they look at one side of the flashcard, they try to remember what the meaning is, then they turn over the flashcard and they see if they were correct. But the thing is, this isn't really how the brain is supposed to learn a language. You can think of this forced memorization of new vocabulary as a kind of artificial way to learn new words in a language. But there is actually a more natural way, a more natural process to learn new vocabulary in a language, and it's called comprehensible input. But how can you learn new vocabulary if you don't try to remember it? How can you learn new words without memorizing them? Well, let me give you an example. Let's take the verb to scratch. Through watching lots of different videos in English and listening to lots of English, you will see this verb and hear this verb to scratch appear many different times as you're listening. While watching a video, you may hear somebody say, "As you can see, this cat is scratching the sofa." Then later on, when you're watching a different video, you may hear somebody else say, "My dog always tries to scratch me when I stroke him." And so now this is your second time hearing the verb to scratch. And then you hear the verb to scratch a third time. You hear somebody else say, "This tiger has claws that it can use to scratch you." When you hear this verb to scratch for the third time, the verb will now be quite familiar to you. You may not know exactly what it means, but it will be quite familiar. You will think like, I think maybe I know what that new word means. But then you hear the verb a fourth time. You hear somebody say, "You know, I always scratch my face when I'm feeling nervous." And now that you hear the verb for a fourth time, this time you may actually understand what that verb means. The fourth time you know this time what it means. But then you hear the same verb again for a fifth time. You hear somebody say, "I've been scratching my leg all day because it's so itchy." Now the fifth time that you hear the word to scratch, you will probably know what it means immediately, and you will not have to think about it, and you will just know immediately what it means. And then you will hear the verb to scratch a sixth time, seventh time, eighth time, ninth time, and eventually 20 or 30 times. And by then, this verb to scratch has been learned in a very deep way in your mind, and it will never be forgotten for the rest of your life. Now, at no point did you try to memorize or remember the verb to scratch. It was just learned through a natural process of listening to English and listening to comprehensible input, which goes to show that it's very much possible to learn new vocabulary just through listening and just through watching videos. Of course, it's also possible to learn new vocabulary by reading, but I recommend you learn vocabulary by listening, and I explain why in this video here. So it's possible to learn vocabulary without memorizing lists of words, without using flashcards, and just by listening to English. But it's not only possible to learn like this, it's actually more effective to learn vocabulary in this way. because you see the new vocabulary used in a real context. This boy is daydreaming. He's daydreaming. So he is thinking about something else completely. So he's not painting anymore, he is daydreaming. When you learn new words through comprehensible input, you learn them in context. So you really get a deep understanding of when to use the word and in what situations it is appropriate to use this word. When you learn vocabulary with flashcards or with lists, you don't really understand exactly what situations this word should be used. You may kind of have an idea of what the word means. You have the definition of the word. You have maybe the translation of the word into your own language, but you don't really understand when and in which situations this word should be used. And that is why many people who are learning English or any other language will kind of choose the wrong word for the situation. For example, a non-native speaker of English may say something like, I was walking down the street and then I met my friend. Now, using the verb to meet in this situation is just not quite right. It would be more natural to say something like, I was walking down the street and I bumped into my friend. Or maybe I came across my friend on the street. When you try to memorize vocabulary, you learn the words in an abstract way out of context. But if you learn vocabulary through comprehensible input, you learn vocabulary in context, which means that you have a deeper understanding of the word. The goal of comprehensible input is to see and be exposed to new vocabulary in as many different contexts as you can. The more different contexts that you see a word being used, the more deeply you will understand that word. This is very good for words that have more than one meaning in English. Words like get or take, or some of the modal verbs like could, would, and should. These words that have many different meanings. It's difficult to learn the different meanings through memorization and grammar exercises and so on. It's much easier to learn the different meanings of these words by getting lots of comprehensible input and just getting to know when the different meanings are used and what they mean. This is also true for phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs like take up, take after, and take over. If you have these three verbs written in a list and you try to memorize take up, take after, and take over, it's going to be very difficult for you to remember and memorize each of these phrasal verbs because they just look very similar. But if you learn these phrasal verbs naturally, just by using comprehensible input, you will see the different situations when each of these phrasal verbs are used. And you will quickly realize that, no, these three phrasal verbs are very different. They are not similar at all. Just because they have the word take in them, the meaning is not similar at all. And if you hear these phrasal verbs used enough using comprehensible input, it will become obvious to you. It will be like, well, of course, take up means this, and take after means this. In fact, you will not really think about it, you will just know. The fact is that you can't memorize a language. You won't speak fluently in a language by remembering with your memory, remembering each word that you use when you're speaking. In fact, trying to do this is when people start to hesitate and talk slowly in their language. If you want to speak English fluently and naturally, you can't do this with your memory. That's just not how learning a language works. You need to learn new vocabulary in a very deep way that you can then express easily because the vocabulary has been deeply learned in your mind. The other thing is, for a lot of people learning English and other languages, trying to memorize words and having lists of words and using flashcards is just quite boring and frustrating for a lot of people. Some students do enjoy it, but quite a lot find it quite boring. Whereas comprehensible input, for a lot of students, it's a lot more enjoyable and kind of fun to learn a language through comprehensible input than it is to try to memorize new words. And the thing is, it's actually not necessary to do things like flashcards. It's not necessary to remember or try to remember new vocabulary in a language, because you can learn all the vocabulary you need in a very natural way by simply watching and listening to hundreds and hundreds of hours of English at the correct level for you using comprehensible input. Actually, on EnglishSponge.com, we have videos at every single level for you so that you can just keep listening and watching English every single day and just gradually and naturally learn new vocabulary as you watch the videos. Some people will say that using memorization techniques like flashcards and lists of words and maybe drills and things like that can make the process of learning a language faster. And that could be true. Even people who like to try and learn languages very fast, and they like to use lots of different techniques, memorization techniques, to help speed up the process of learning vocabulary, even they will still have to listen to many, many hours of comprehensible input after they've tried memorizing the new vocabulary. But the fact is, you can learn all the vocabulary you need without any memorization, any remembering at all. So if somebody asks me, how can I learn 10 new words a day in English? How can I memorize 20 new words? How can I memorize 30 new words in English every single day? I will tell them, don't try to memorize them. Don't try to learn or remember 20 new words a day. Just instead, I would recommend that you try to get 1 hour of comprehensible input every day, or 30 minutes of comprehensible input every day, and you will learn new vocabulary without trying to memorize each word individually outside of its context. Just watch comprehensible input and new vocabulary will appear naturally in the videos that you watch. Anyway, that's all from me. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.